After Richard Spencer's rousing speech yesterday, I think it's one of the first times that I've been kind of sad to make the clarification that while I am from PwC, I'm not an accountant. I'm an environmental economist. And I chose to interpret my question as the future of corporate natural capital accounting. But then that sounded a bit grand, so I wanted to make clear that it's just my opinion, and I have as little idea of what the future really holds as anybody. But maybe this is what I feel like it should be. So I'm going to say a bit about the past of corporate natural capital accounting, and I said the past rather than the history of, because I think the future probably mostly needs a break with the past of corporate natural capital accounting. Then I'll talk about a bit of what I see in the present that I think does have a big part to play in the future, and then I'll say a bit about what I think the key elements need to be. So quantitative, it needs to be aware of the value chain of companies. It needs to be spatial, systems aware, dynamic, and I would argue it needs to be valued. So it would have been a bit of a cheap joke, but I could have left this slide at this. We did instead I did that. We did a review of the annual reports of the FTSE 100 companies looking for the term natural capital about 12 months ago. Would anyone care to guess how many of them featured that term? 2. But one of them, I won't go into why, but one of them kind of included it by accident. So really it was 1. But actually, of course, as many people have observed yesterday, already today, corporates are pretty good at accounting for certain aspects of natural capital, the bits that are priced in markets, and where the property rights are clear or where regulation has perhaps intervened, some of that is even sustainable. They're not so good at the bits that are unpriced. These were Google's best efforts at the atmosphere, the oceans, and natural capital, the bottom one. So, of course, there's been tons of work in the corporate sphere on environmental accounting of one kind or another. From the sort of opaque world of qualitative environmental reporting, multi-criteria analysis, to the sort of slightly broken world, I would argue, of environmental impact assessment, and the weird and just occasionally wonderful world of life cycle assessment for anyone who's familiar. And what do these all have in common from the point of view of accounting for natural capital in a meaningful way? Well, they're woefully unfit for purpose, I would argue. So, what do we see in the present of corporates' attempts to account for natural capital and their relationships with it that probably does have a place in the future? And I probably should have said this earlier. When I talk about natural capital accounting and management by corporates, I've long since given up trying to argue with people who abuse that term and use it wildly. You know, a few years ago I used to say, well, look, if we're talking about natural capital accounting, we're talking about accounting for capital stocks, and you know, that's where it should stop. And if we're talking about environmental impacts, well, then we should call it that. But actually, as a term, it has such traction that I've just decided to go with the flow and say, look, natural capital accounting describes corporate impacts and corporate relationships with natural capital, stocks, flows, whatever. So, I can almost hear the groans. If this was a business audience, there would definitely be groans, because this is the most endlessly cited example. But what Puma did was quite good, and it was quite groundbreaking, and it was quite exciting, I would even say. So, for anyone who hasn't seen this, they looked at their environmental impacts, and they quantified and valued the externalities that they were causing from their operations. That's where we've got Puma operations, the top row. And then from the 4 big tiers of their supply chain. So tier 4 is the sort of agricultural raw material production, the leather, the rubber, the plastics, the cotton that they use. They did this. They also did some stuff about it. So for example, they had a big look into what materials they were using. Now since Puma, lots of other organizations have used these methods. They haven't been quite so public about them. And some people are certainly disappointed by that. Personally, I applaud Puma for what they did, but I also applaud the companies who are having a proper look and trying to understand their interactions with natural capital before they start talking about it. I'm always skeptical of companies whose first objective is communication, because actually I think everyone here is aware that management of company relationships with natural capital is far more important. Exhibit B. So we heard a bit about the Natural Capital Committee yesterday, and one of the work streams I don't think we heard about, at least not in the sessions I was in, was the fact that they are also engaging very actively with the private sector. Now, their remit is to look at how to maintain and improve the natural capital in the UK. A lot of that natural capital is owned or managed or stewarded by organisations that are in the private sector. So they've got a great stream of work going on particularly with big landowners, to pilot a framework for corporate natural capital accounting. This is different to the kind of work that Puma did. You know, Puma have very small land holdings themselves, but huge impacts on natural capital in their supply chain and through the use of their products. Here we're looking at organizations that have big land holdings themselves. They actually are responsible for the stewardship and maintenance of big natural capital assets. And that's what the framework that the Natural Capital Committee have been working on is focused on. It's not actually out yet, so I put up their rather dry cover of their last State of Natural Capital report instead. So I think that kind of accounting is part of the future as well. And my choice has nothing to do with the fact that we were also involved with it. So, Exhibit C to Y. You can see that I was busy on Google late at night when I was writing my slides. These are supposed to represent things that are going on more in the sphere of most of the people in this room and less in corporate contexts. You know, I've tried pitching dynamic environmental scenario modeling to CFOs, and rarely do they go for it, I have to say. But there's a hell of a lot of stuff out there which corporates need to be using and applying in their understanding of their relationships with natural capital. Now the challenge is, how do we take the sound science and put it into ways that are workable for businesses? Because the standard reaction when you put any of this kind of stuff in front of a business is, it's all far too complicated. You know, it all sounds terribly complicated, and we need to make it far simpler. You know, I see my task as really simplifying and dumbing down what a lot of the great work that many of the people in this room do, but retaining enough of the underpinning complexity that it's still meaningful. And that's a challenge, and it's a pragmatic challenge that we have to address with corporates effectively. So that's a big bit of the future. And then Exhibit Z, we heard from Peter van der Haag yesterday, the Natural Capital Coalition. What it's trying to do is really bring together the best of what's out there. We're giving our methodologies into that process. I hope and believe that many others are as well. And I've got high hopes. So, trying to draw out more of the specifics of what I think the future of corporate natural capital accounting needs to involve. It needs to be quantitative. I kind of ummed and ahed about what to put on this slide. I think, and in the end I went for this system diagram that we produced last week for a client of ours, because I think the idea of looking at this system, I'm sure you can't read it, but in anything other than a quantitative way, and getting meaningful results out of it is far-fetched. And if you're trying to compare this system to 5 other systems, it's even more far-fetched. I think I certainly agree that corporate decision makers are sophisticated, and they can, on a case-by-case basis, cope with complex, multi-criteria information. They can cope with qualitative analysis. You know, they're very smart. But that is on a case-by-case basis. And if we want corporate interactions with natural capital to be part of their mainstream management systems, which is what I want, then we have to quantify it. We have to systematize the information, and I'll argue in a sec, we have to value it as well. So the future considers the value chain. This is true across, you know, all aspects of corporate life, it's probably fair to say, and equally true for natural capital. Less window dressing, less wind turbines at head office, more, you know, focus on if I've got a huge agricultural supply chain, what challenges does that present me in the future, and what is the production that goes into my products, what impacts is that having on the environment? So yes, the operations, yes, the supply chain. For lots of organizations that we work with, actually, by far the biggest impacts are as a result of the use of their products. And you know, a company that is focused on its own narrow operations and not redesigning and redefining its products is missing the point. This, again, I suspect that to the people in this room, this will seem phenomenally obvious, but most corporate environmental information is not spatial. It's not spatially defined. Most life cycle assessment, life cycle inventory databases are not spatially explicit. They have these bizarre sort of global average impact on water courses and these very strange characterization metrics. There's a lot of great work with life cycle assessment, don't get me wrong. It's a powerful tool, but the fact that it's not spatial is really beginning to hurt it in terms of its application to natural capital. And obviously, place is key when we're thinking about natural capital. So, the future is dynamic. It definitely is. The future of corporate natural capital accounting it needs to be dynamic. It needs to be forward-looking. The financial accounting approaches of recording what happened this year and what's happened all the years previously aren't a great deal of use when we're talking about ecological systems, because what matters to a business in that context is what's going to happen. So climate scenarios, very relevant, pulled straight out of the National Ecosystem Assessment, you know, scenarios for how our ecosystems are going to look and how we as societies are going to treat them in the future. These are the kinds of things, and actually, for the first time the other day, which was very exciting for an economist working in a consultancy, a client actually came to me and asked me to do a Monte Carlo analysis and some probabilistic assessment of scenarios for what the environment was going to look like and how that was going to impact their business. Now, I've been pitching that kind of thing for ages. It's infuriating. So finally, the future is valued. These are some of the metrics that corporates deal with. And they probably mean something to most of the people in this room. They don't mean a damn thing to almost any CEO. And trying to get a message through based on environmental metrics, indices, whatever, it's a real challenge. So this slide looks a bit blunt. I'm sure we'll talk about it in Q&A, and I would really like to. In my experience, this is pretty fundamental. To communicate effectively and change decisions, we need to put environmental concerns into common metrics. And actually, money is a good metric because a lot of decisions are made on the basis of money. And so a comparability to that as well is also helpful. Now, typically, when we're doing a Puma-style assessment, for example, we're looking at the value of the impacts on society. So we're applying welfare economics techniques for the economists in the room. We're assessing change in human welfare, change in human well-being, and that's what we're valuing. A really quick last slide. What's the point of valuation? This is just pulled from a recent study. So the exam question from the company was, where should we focus our efforts? Where should we focus our limited resources on reducing our water consumption? They said we've got massive water consumption in the US, so that's where we're doing it at the moment. But they wanted to know, what are the societal impacts of that water consumption? Because that's why they wanted to reduce it. It wasn't about the risk to their operations directly. And what we said was, well, actually, in the US, although some of the places you're operating, the water is scarce, the infrastructure is good. The external impacts of you consuming a bunch of water in the US are pretty nominal. Whereas if you do that somewhere where water is scarce, but actually people are more directly impacted, they're much greater. Now what you see as I build this out is that scarcity is an important factor, but it's far from the only factor. These calculations take into account the infrastructure, the level of human development, because the competition between corporates and, for example, farmers for water resources can have impacts on nutrition. And the scale of those societal impacts can be huge. So actually, what they ended up doing was focusing deeper in their supply chain on some of these countries where their real external impacts were much more significant. Thanks very much.